Good afternoon to you, Mark Sutt with HurricaneTrack.com here with your hurricane outlook and discussion for Monday, July 24th, 2017. It's Monday, so that means we have a lot to talk about today, even if there's nothing brewing in the Atlantic Basin. We always have some things that we can learn from. So let's start out with a look at the climatological aspect of things for this time period here. The last third of July, where do we typically see things develop, and where do they typically track? Well, the National Hurricane Center, with the help of probably lots of people to put this map together when it's all said and done, have created such a thing. And you can see that really, as we get to the end of the month here, the entire Atlantic Basin out towards Africa and the subtropics up here, the Bahamas and the Gulf of Mexico are all very active. But notice the very noticeable lack of activity through this area here in the Western Caribbean, the Northwest Caribbean, and really if you take these two systems out, it's pretty much the entire Caribbean Sea that's still pretty inactive during this time of year, and that's owed to the pressure gradient that still exists through this region, that if something hasn't developed by the time it gets to the Caribbean, it usually doesn't until later on, and a lot of times that'll wait until over here in the Eastern Pacific, where it's quite busy typically this time of year, and this week is no exception. We're going to go over that. So this just gives you an idea that still the Atlantic Basin not very busy as we round out the month of July. Remember, this is going back to 1851, and before you wonder and scratch your head, well, how did we know about things back in 1851? Well, remember, there were lots of ships out here, and there were settlements. You know, if you saw Pirates of the Caribbean, you know all about that, right? Now, all kidding aside, there were ships, and there were settlements, and records were kept, and there were no satellites and things like that, obviously, but there were enough records to indicate, you know, especially once we got closer and closer to the 1900s, and meteorological records were better kept, especially, you think about down in the deep tropics, the Cubans, they did a great job. And spreading on down into what we call the West Indies. Yeah, you bet, because of shipping interests, we knew, you know, better than having no data, and it helped to develop the climatological record. So that's what it looks like during this 10 days. And you can imagine that as this changes over to the first 10 days of August, and that's coming up obviously in about a week, things will start to change. All right, moving on, let's look at what the SOI is, because this we have been talking about since really January. And it took a pretty good dive in June, was -9, and that is into the realm of what we would consider favorable for an El Niño to develop. And so at that point we see, does it sustain? Well, this 30 days that's ongoing, and this is a running 30 days up here, this would be just June by itself, May by itself, etc. So the running 30 days has climbed, let's see, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 points, right? +5 so far, so it's going to have to really, really go negative to get anywhere near this number for July, and it's probably not going to do that. And you can see even today's daily contributor is +2, and even the 90-day is -1, and typically we need to see a -7 or lower for the state of the atmosphere to support the El Niño to develop. It's the way the pressure patterns are out there, and we've changed that. So no chance of an El Niño setting in for this hurricane season. I don't see that happening. You know, the evidence doesn't show it, the SOI, you name it. So looking at the Eastern Pacific, you do have a few cold patches sitting in here. Overall, it's on the warm neutral state here in the Eastern Pacific through the Central Pacific. And then the Atlantic Basin, of course, the main development region, all the way over to the Gulf of Mexico, running quite a bit above the long-term average. Subtropical Atlantic up here, the Northwest Atlantic Basin, also warmer than it should be. And so now the question is, will the hurricanes come? Obviously, most people don't want to be hit by one, even though I like to study them. I don't want one to hit where I live, here in Wilmington, North Carolina. And before you go and say, oh, hooey, you know you want a hurricane there, let me tell you, the storm itself might be exciting. I can't argue with that. A lot of people feel that way. It's something different. But think about it. you get through the storm itself and then the aftermath, that's what the real problem is. And we'll talk about that another day. But everything is set up in terms of the water profile, the temperature profile, for it to be an active season. And obviously a lot of people are wondering, will that come to fruition? And we'll get into that a little bit more later in today's update as well. All right, looking at the upper ocean heat content, that is advancing along as we would expect it to. And you can see even sort of the edges of it here, where you just begin to get a richer, deeper area of warm water. That covers a huge area of the Atlantic Basin. Think of these as different zones. I mean, even out here, as long as the water temperatures are near 80 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface, you can get development. But it's in these areas that I have drawn in south and west, all this area through here, where the upper ocean heat content is substantial. And then especially so here in the Northwest Caribbean. You can see how the Gulf has filled in, and it's also fairly high off the southeast coast. So that certainly is in place. It may be a little bit more in some areas than we have seen in recent years, less in others. But the bottom line, the Atlantic Basin is warm enough now, and we still have plenty of warming to go. Remember, even though we have reached the longest day of the year in June and the solstice, the sun's energy is still being stored. There's a lag. And you turn the eye of the stove off, and the stove is not immediately cool enough to touch, right? And the ocean is sort of the same way. It takes a while for that eye of the stove to heat up, and in this case it takes a while for the ocean to heat, and it takes a while for that heat to be released, and oftentimes it is released in some part through tropical cyclones. Looking at the Gulf of Mexico, wow, what a change this was since Cindy. All of this area through here that you see in this sort of weird green color is 30 degrees Celsius or higher. There's even a little bullseye of 31 Celsius south of Cuba. This is fairly typical the way the shallow water is there. And I mean, we talked about after Cindy that the upwelling could cause a temporary cooling, and boy, that was temporary. 30 Celsius, imagine that. I think that's like 85, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So the Gulf of Mexico, the surface of the Gulf anyway, certainly very warm for intense hurricanes. The Atlantic, the Western Atlantic Basin, lots of areas through here with 29 degrees Celsius. And what I want to point out, this is important, the 26 Celsius line is right here. 26 Celsius is roughly 79.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And look how far north, I'm sorry, that's 25 right there, isn't it? Yeah, I kind of screwed up. Let me start over. That little 5 right there looked like a 6. Maybe I need glasses. That's the 26C line right there. Take 2. And that's pretty far north. It's not, abnormal or alarming. It's not like it's all the way up here off of Cape Cod. That would be certainly upsetting for a number of reasons. It'd be a pretty big ecologic problem to have 80-degree water temperatures right off of Cape Cod. Well, that's not the case, okay? This is not Fantasyland, day after tomorrow kind of stuff. I guess in that case, the North Atlantic current pretty much collapsed. But in this case, the 26C line is, pretty far north there, 38 degrees latitude. And that matters not only for you folks that want to go swimming here in Atlantic City and up in Belmar and along parts of Long Island, etc., but huge if, you get a hurricane running the coast, how much warm water is out here for that to take advantage of? And so we need to be watching this closely over the next few weeks. And, some can say, hey, you're speculating, you're alarming people. Well, if you're alarmed, then I don't know what to tell you. I mean, you have to look at this stuff. It's important. And if a hurricane comes, at least we are prepared from a mental standpoint that we knew the possibility was there. It's just like if you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, you're putting on a little weight, your blood pressure's going up a little bit. I don't want to alarm you, but if you don't keep this under control, you could have problems down the road. You don't yell at the doctor. Maybe some people do, but I wouldn't. I would appreciate it. I would say, hey, the advice is great. You're an expert. You know what you're talking about. I'll take it under advisement and hopefully do something to get myself better in shape because you still have time. So pointing out certain factors in the ocean and the atmosphere that may lead to development later on, You definitely want people to be aware and not to just go willy-nilly about their business, as if nothing is going to ever happen again. And we live in a world where the 24-hour news cycle seems to have been shortened to 6 hours, and maybe even less, honestly. And so people need reminding. They do. And if they are alarmed, then they need to maybe start over and relax a little bit and try to see the bigger picture that it's hurricane season. We need to be ready for 6 months out of the year. And the simple fact that luck favors the prepared. And that's all I'm going to say about that. So water temperature is warming up, and we'll continue to watch how this evolves over time. And you bet this area up here in New England and the mid-Atlantic states, huge population area, Sandy notwithstanding, it has been a long time since a major event has been through that region. And so we want to make sure that people up here are at least cognizant of what may or may not be coming, because until after November 30th, you should definitely be on alert. All right, looking at the Atlantic Basin, I tell you, there's nothing to worry about in the coming several days. Everything's nice and quiet. The visible satellite picture here telling the story very well. We do have a little bit of a frontal boundary trying to sort of ease its way across the southeast here. Sometimes those can drape across the warm waters and develop into something, but I don't see that happening in any of the model output in the medium range. So no worries there, but if you're in a boat in the Gulf Stream, etc., be aware of these showers and thunderstorms. If you're heading down to the Lesser Antilles, it's about as beautiful as you can ask for. Very, very little convection through here right now. A very suppressed phase of the Madden-Julian oscillation happening. Basically, we have sinking motion in the atmosphere. We still have a very dry pattern throughout this area due to Saharan air, and that's going to be the status quo for the next several days. And again, it is perfectly normal to see this probably all the way up until about August the 15th. After the 15th, you usually begin to see a gradual and steady change in the way things happen in the Northern Hemisphere. So it could be a few more weeks, which is fine by me, and I'm sure fine by a lot of other people. Nope, we don't want to exit. So the Saharan air, not as prevalent overall, and is starting to retreat more to the north, the denser values of it. And so in the southern part here, the lower latitudes, it's thinning out, and it's a process, all right? And even over Africa, the suppressing nature of the MJO taking its toll, if you will. This is a pretty healthy tropical wave curled up here, but Saharan air is close by that it should keep this choked off with dry air. Now, in the Pacific, quite a different story, and since nothing looks imminent that it's going to threaten land, I can chuckle about it, because this is pretty amazing. It's like, why is the Eastern Pacific so active? We haven't had much at all of anything in the Western Pacific. Usually that basin leads the way in what we call accumulated cyclone energy, but the Eastern Pacific is definitely far and away the leader right now. And really it's just the upward motion, the rising motion of the atmosphere has been sort of semi-permanent over the East Pac over the last few weeks here, and we've rattled them off one after the other. Fernanda has now dissipated into just a remnant swirl. Now we have Tropical Storm Greg here. I'm just going to get my pointer back. And then Hillary formed after Greg, and so now we have Irwin that formed after Hillary. So Irwin is sort of sandwiched in between. And these are the two right here that I want to talk about, because there's a potential for something really interesting to happen, and we're going to look at that in just a moment. First, a peek down the road through about the 7th of August, as if I can get my color tool. The next 2 weeks, the usual fairly, what would you call it? Partisan, is that the word I'm looking for? Discrepancies, whatever, in the two models. This is the GFS. And you see what it's doing with the MJO. These are the phases that we worry about the most over here. I shouldn't say worry. That's not the correct terminology. Watch for. These are the phases that we watch for. Sometimes it can lead to worry, honestly, but not anytime soon. And if we look at the ECMWF, it's similar. I mean, those are not two completely in different universes, but they're not too much of an agreement either. but at least we're not seeing the GFS, wildly swinging out. Where's the start? This is so muddled, it's hard to tell. Looks like it's about right there. At least we're not seeing something like this with the GFS. And then if we go to the euro, it's like that. That would be rather upsetting if we can't even, count on the GFS to be in the same realm. The bottom line is, as I just kind of ramble on and on, neither the GFS nor the euro and their ensemble members are indicating a favorable pattern of upward motion for the Atlantic Basin. And so, you got to wonder, well, then how on earth, if it's not really favoring the Western Hemisphere, is the Eastern Pacific so busy? Well, we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. I just want to show you this. This is the next 5 days, I think it is, of the GFS. I'm going to just speed it up here. And you notice coming off Africa, this is the 850 millibar level. Really nothing out here in the main development region in terms of energy that tries to gather. Around 80 hours, 90 hours or so, there's a little piece that comes across the Cape Verde Islands. And then it kind of dries up and fizzles out. We'll see. It's getting to be the time of year where these will come off more to the north. The Saharan air layer will start to abate more. And in fact, the more of this energy that we see across these northern latitudes of Africa here, the more that Saharan air will get beat down, and then these tropical waves can come off in a more moist environment. You also notice nothing approaching the Windward Islands and nothing through the Gulf or the Caribbean Sea. So that's good news there. Now this is what I wanted to show you. The Eastern Pacific. How often have I done this? I don't think at all this year. We haven't really had to. A couple things I want to point out. This is also at 5,000 feet in the atmosphere, the 850 millibar level. That's the remnants of Fernanda. A few showers and little, extra wind or whatever, breezes over near Hawaii, but that's about it. And then we have Greg here, Irwin here, and Hillary, if I have that right. Should go back to that other map. Make sure I do. Yes, Hillary is the farther east one. And in the Eastern Pacific, and this is what I wanted to show you. So we just kind of have this favorable pattern, almost like this grapevine that I talk about, this favorable pattern in the lower levels of the atmosphere that has favored convergence at the surface, the tropical energy coming together, and then the atmosphere has been such with sort of its own upward motion pocket, even though it's not directly associated with the Madden-Julian oscillation. See what I mean? The atmosphere is complex. So you have this one area in the Western Hemisphere that's been favorable, and that just hasn't spilled over into the Atlantic Basin, because usually when you have all this rising motion here, and that's what all of these systems represent, air coming together at the surface, rising pretty violently in some cases, right? And then it spreads out all across almost to the stratosphere, and then that has to sink, and it does so in the Atlantic Basin. That's an oversimplification of it, but usually when the Eastern Pacific is very active, the Atlantic Basin won't be, and vice versa. All right, so with that being said, watch what happens. This is going to cover 7 days. Why 7? Well, in the Pacific, it's a little easier, at least this time of year, to forecast things that far out. But I want you to watch what happens, because this is rather interesting. Put these into motion. I want to speed this up too. So don't worry about what's going on with Greg over here. This is really a non-issue. Watch what happens with Irwin to the west there and Hillary closer to the east as they sort of pinwheel around each other. See, Irwin comes back, and a very strange interaction. Some people, you look at this and you think, you've heard this term before, the Fujiwara effect. What is that? Well, people often ask, can two systems, tropical cyclones, collide and then become like a super tropical cyclone, a super hurricane, or a super typhoon? Usually, that's not what happens. They pinwheel around each other in what's called the Fujiwara effect, and the weaker one usually gets absorbed by the stronger one, and both of them typically suffer as a result because there's only so much energy. And the same thing usually holds true in the universe. It's really, you're going to be like, oh boy, you're losing us. You think about how galaxies are. Galaxies collide, if you know astronomy, and usually the two of them, they don't just form a super galaxy. there's all kind of chaos, and the energy gets kind of thrown around, and you have two sort of discombobulated galaxies when that happens. And the same thing, well, not the same thing, but close enough in nature here on the Earth with these storms. You have these two systems interacting with each other, and they both typically suffer. So no, they usually don't collide and form one giant one. That's usually left to the minds of those who make popcorn movies for the summer. And it's not in real life. So we'll see what happens with this over the next few days. Yes, towards the end of the period there, and I'll just stop this and move to the last frame right there. I mean, for what it's worth, California, let me draw this for you, is right here, and the LA Basin down there. So that's not a whole heck of a lot of distance away from Southern California. So we'll need to keep an eye on this. Could be some added moisture for the region. But we have to see. I'm going to look more into the Fujiwara phenomenon and talk about it in more detail on Thursday's update. I may do an update before Thursday, depending on what's going to happen here with Hillary, maybe headed for California. And no, there will be zero political jokes at all. You may make them in the comments all you like, just keep it clean, but not from me. That's not my realm. Hillary headed to California. That's a weather phenomenon, and we're going to watch that because that's a lot of moisture and a lot of energy sitting just offshore, so we'll have to see. So maybe I'll be back before Wednesday. I'll keep my eye on it. Like I said, there was a lot to talk about today. Really, the bottom line is to sum it all up. If you want to just skip to the end and say, oh my goodness, this was so long, I'm skipping to the end. The Cliff Notes version, Atlantic Basin quiet probably for the next week to 10 days. The East Pacific, very, very busy. And we'll see when we get to August, when things naturally start to change, how all the background state of favorability begins to play in. Again, we know that things are in the favorable category overall. It's kind of like you got the cake ready to go to put in the oven. Now we just need to see if the oven actually gets turned on. Bad cake analogy, but that's what I'm going to stick with. And we just don't know for sure. You can have all the evidence in the world to point towards it being an active season, but you never know for sure. But I tell you what, that's some pretty overwhelming evidence if you ask me. All right, have a great rest of your Monday. Thanks as always for your time and attention. I'm Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com. I'll talk to you definitely by Thursday, if not before then.